Thank you very much for the presentation. I also want to thank you for being here and the organizers and Sarah. I'm very happy to present my work. And well, I'm going to talk about a philosophical approach and approximation to the ritual and the mythic features of role-playing games. And the title is suggestive. I mean, we know that a coin has two sides, but that's what I want to remind with this approach. No, and I will talk about symbols in the following. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so the idea that the RPGs are a sort of modern ritual or myth, it's not new, of course. We have these wonderful citations, one from this Dangerous Games book that says fantasy role-playing games then can be taught as a modern form of ritual and myth. Although they do not have the same status as ritual and myth in world religions, these games are powerful because they utilize humanity's most primal faculties of meaning production. And also we have this citation from Sarah's book that says role-playing games fulfill the need for a modern ritual, cultivating the archetypal symbols of myth and providing a co-created social activity for the enactment of meaningful narratives. So my approach here is to recall that myth and ritual, actually, they are not completely independent, so to say. They are related to the symbol. So the main thesis of this presentation of this work is that both of them are the exegeses of symbols. So this suggests, and this is a proposal, that we should treat these features, the ritual and the mythic nature of RPGs, from a symbolic level, from the symbolic point of view. Okay, so let me recall some basic features of rituals and myths, just to compare with RPGs and to have a framework. So in the case of myth, the interpretation and the limitation of the concept has been always a subject of confusion and exaggeration, right? And this is just because we come from the Enlightenment tradition that has displaced the idea of myth and has sort of exaggerated reason, right, against the narratives and so on. And then there is no innocent definition because the concept is overdeterminated, no, both emotionally and ideologically. And I'm not planning to make a definition of myth or ritual. Maybe it's not necessary. So what we need is to identify some elements in order to look at RPGs. No, that's the idea. So there are some major features for myths in this case that they have a narrative character. Of course, they use fantasy in their creation, and that's one of the reasons they have been displaced by the enlightened reason. They have a synthetic power to join contradictions and a connection to the sacred. No, and it's usual to talk about myths in terms of their social function, because they are important to legitimate and constitute our own individual community and communal existence. No, by posing a supreme value. They talk about what matters for us. And on the other hand, we have rituals. Probably the rituals are less difficult to define than myths because they are dramatic acts. We can identify them as a suspension of everyday life in order to establish a temporary, transient, and liminal experience. And in this secondary world, by means of rituals, we can create new roles and support the creation of meaning and redefine our relationship to objects and actions. And then we can identify also some major features of rituals. For example, the onset of a magic circle, the phenomenon of collective effervescence, this liminal character, no, where concepts and meanings are put into question and we redefine them, and as well a connection to the sacred. And ritual in this sense possess a major social function, like this happens with myths, because they are able to strengthen our social bonds and foster the creation of a community. And one important point of them is that participants return socially transformed to their ordinary lives. Okay, so now let me talk about the symbols and how to unify these two perspectives. And to this end, I will talk about the symbols from a specific point of view, and this is the idea of the romantic symbol, the symbol as it was developed conceptually during end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century. And I'm using some ideas drawn from the German philosopher Friedrich Schelling. So as I told you before, the central thesis of the work is that myths and rituals find each other in the symbol. And I will explain with this diagram how it happens. Okay, so according to Schelling, imagination is a powerful faculty, well, it's not clear even in his philosophy what is the connection with reason. But the idea is that the imagination is able to produce representations, and we are going to understand symbols as representations. This means something that presents again an object or an existence that was otherwise manifest, but it's not anymore. And then the representations are organized in this kind of dialectics. We can talk later, if you want, about these dialectics, which is different from the Hegelian the dialectics, that is organized in terms of an opposition. And here it's meaning against being, universality against particularity. So as you can see, the symbol is in between. So on one side, we have the universality of a representation, which the radical limit is the concept, no? This schematic point of view that is universal and has a lot of meaning, but it doesn't have too much being, let's say, it's not real. And on the other side, we have a representation which is exceedingly particular, and it has a lot of reality or being instead of meaning, which is the image. No, an image it is posed as an object that exists, but both of them are representations. So we have this opposition between schema and allegory, and the symbol is in between. It's the undifferentiated balance of universality and particularity, meaning and being, concept and image, schema and allegory. And here then I will understand symbol in three ways that are related, and we can discuss this later in after sessions. It's a unique representation of human imagination, in this way assigned, but also it's an archetypal figure of our culture and psyche, following Jung. And finally, it's an element with which we can understand the metaphysical dynamics of reality as a whole, following this idea of philosophy. Then the main characteristic of symbol, and this will set up the stage for role-playing games, is that symbols are what they mean and mean what they are. Okay, that's the idea of this undifferentiated balance of meaning and being. So this property is called tautegoricity, that the identity of meaning and being. So with the symbolic domain, we have a special relationship, because once a symbol stops to have meaning for us, it ceases to exist. Okay, and the other way around. We do not have control of symbols and their meanings because they have an independent life, so to speak. So the symbolic domain makes it possible to reconcile people in times of crisis, given that it contains the archetypal figures that gave rise to our culture. And here is where it connects with mythic and ritual domains. On the other hand, the symbol is an immediate, inexhaustible, and irreplaceable testimony, because it means what it is. Okay, and then, however spiritually powerful they can be, we only access them through mediation. And myths and rituals are precisely the two ways that we access the symbolic domain. They gather together in the symbol because they are the two possible exegeses. The symbols expressed linguistically in the case of myths, or dramatically in the case of rituals. So the symbolic approach to RPGs that I'm proposing is the following. So we have symbols, and they express themselves in myth and ritual, in narrative and action, okay? And given that the ritual and myth are fundamentally the two sides of the same coin, no, that's the title of the talk, the symbol, this is the coin, neither RPGs can be reduced to mere rituals nor mere myths. So the proposal is that we have to treat the ritual and mythic features of RPGs in the same footing, no, together. On the other hand, that RPGs are essentially symbolic devices. This means that they are a combination of a mythic narrative and a ritual interpretation. So RPGs are symbolic in themselves, but they are not symbols, of course. No, and that's why I'm using the word devices, because we are using them to get narratively and dramatically into a direct engagement with the symbolic domain. And we cannot create symbols. Well, this has to be discussed, no? But being like sort of conservative in this direction, no? We are not using RPGs to create symbols, but to redefine our relationship with them. No, we create like a liminal space where narratively and dramatically we interact with the symbols that give rise to our culture. And then in my article, I revisit some of the ritual elements in RPGs, like the magic circle, the collective effervescence, liminality, and so on. But then just to go to the end of the talk, so this idea of symbolic devices, it's to establish some differences between RPGs and other kind of narratives, okay? And the main difference is that in this deep connection between meaning and being, it happens that we truly experience the narrative with RPGs, and we know this, no, as a character, because we enter the RPG magic circle as a player, and here we are working in two levels at the same time, the ritual and the mythic. In this sense, the ritual part of the RPG creates the space for the narrative to flourish, no, in a mythic way, to create this lasting feeling that we have done things that matter and stories that can share with other people that even have not played that particular session or game. And on the other hand, the shared narrative that we have preserves the ludic, the ludic activity as itself. So this undifferentiated balance between ritual and myth gives these particular features to RPGs from the symbolic point of view. No, that's the proposal. So RPGs will work at the symbolic level, and I take this citation, this quotation from Laycock that says, "On a small scale, games invoke the very mechanism through which all human culture is created. By doing so, they create a unique mental space in which players rethink their world and themselves in order to create new worlds and new selves." Okay, and this schematic is the idea of how it works. No, we can discuss it later. No, I'm here to have feedback from you and all the fields that you know very well. No, because I believe that to attack these problems, to understand them, we need this multidisciplinary approach, right? So the idea is that as symbolic devices, the RPGs feed upon the cultural elements that the participants bring to the table. And then in this liminal state, the RPGs allows us to create, change, and reconfigure our relationship with the archetypal figures, right? And I'm taking this a model of the figures that occur or happen in RPGs from Wascool, where we have the real world, the imaginary world, and the fantastic world. And what happens, no, in these schematics is that the person that brings the cultural elements enters the imaginary world as a player and then becomes a character. No, there are three figures in which we are playing and along. And the result of an RPG here is that the testimony of the experience becomes a personal mythology. No, and that's the direction I'm trying to understand right now. So we get into the mythic and ritual features of role-playing games, no, interact with the symbols, and the result is to have this personal mythology, these lasting stories that actually redefine our lives after playing role-playing games, and redefine our communities and relationship with the society. We are transformed by the activity, no? And this is the evidence. It's these strong anecdotes and bonds and a new perspective of ourselves and others. And in this way, symbols, no, they come from the collective unconscious or society as a whole, or a metaphysical or a spiritual considerations. It doesn't matter, no, it works. We work with them, right? And I'm going to the conclusion. So that's the takeaway message I wanted to share with you, that in this way, RPGs will be recognized as a perfect combination, undifferentiated balance of mythic narrative and ritual interpretation. And going beyond that, following Schelling, art and organism are symbolic as well. Okay, there is a connection that we can discuss later, because they possess a telos, a finality inside them. In other words, both art and organism, they stand by themselves and serve no other purpose than keeping themselves alive. Okay, And that happens for the symbols as well. And thus, in this way, RPGs bring us the opportunity to have this symbolic deepness. No, I will finish with this quotation that says, it also gives this world, the world of RPGs, a kind of autonomy from us, letting us experience the world as if it is unfolding itself, even though all its elements are contributed by us. So then there is not an analogy, but like a metaphysical relationship between symbols, art, and organisms, and those for RPGs from a symbolic point of view. No, we can consider them art, we can consider them a living thing. And from the symbolic perspective, I will define RPGs as living mythic rituals and the art of the ironic and collaborative imagination, right? And just to finish, no, there are some lines for future work, like study the personal mythic narrative from the symbolic approach, looking at the differences between a LARP and tabletop RPGs, no, and so on. And just a quick commercial, no. So we have this role-playing studies researcher network. You can approach with me. We will be happy to invite you for giving a Zoom lecture or seminar. And also, we are launching a journal of role-playing studies and STEAM in collaboration with the New Jersey Institute of Technology. So soon we will have some call for papers. And I thank you very much for your attention.